definitions that we covered yesterday. We'll cover some more today. Okay. Here we're going to talk about some communicable diseases. Some of the stuff that we're going to cover moving forward you may have already seen. Okay. Here's some learning objectives. Big things we're going to talk about attack rates. So a lot of those are going to be definitions that you're going to need to know for your exam. This one is basically the definition for communicable disease, specific infectious agent for its toxic products, right? Some of those are these toxins inside of our body. Okay. For an infected person, animal, or inanimate objects, remember fomites can also spread communicable diseases, whether it be directly or indirectly. Right. And that could be from bacteria, viruses, parasites, or fungi. Okay. And your definition for infection: entry and development or multiplication of an infectious agent in the body, a person or animal. Nothing we don't already know. Okay. Infection doesn't necessarily mean that you're infectious or have an infectious disease. It just means that you have something. Now, we say this is extremely important, and we call it the iceberg effect. Right? The parts in red are the parts that we, as providers, generally see. The parts in green are the parts that we generally don't see. The parts in green are the parts that can possibly spread disease. As you can see, the part on the bottom is way bigger than the part on the top. So only the small part is the part that we actually interact with. The larger part on the bottom is the part that goes out and starts spreading stuff. Right? So clinical stuff would be things that present really, really slow, where you may or may not have any kind of symptoms, but you may also be infectious during the time period. Okay? Your exposure without infection means you're asymptomatic, or preclinical asymptomatic typhoid malaria. And if we can detect some of these things early, we can kind of prevent that spread. If we can address some of the hidden population, which be somewhere in that green area, would be some of that hidden population that's not going to come see. We detect those guys, we can address that. In the civilian sector, it's a little bit easier to understand the burden of disease, because in our reality, we just use time and monetary effects for that, compared to the military, where we'll talk about later. This becomes a little bit more dangerous. Two definitions: latent period, infection with no active multiplication or agent. You guys remember that latent period means that you have no symptoms and you are not infectious. Have no symptoms and you are not infectious. That means it's not growing inside you, it's just hanging out, it's dormant. Okay? In another word. And then you have your carrier state here. Right? Individuals who harbor the organism, but it's inapparent by serologic studies or by evidence of clinical illness. Or that'd be like a typhoid Mary. She actually had typhoid. She got better. No symptoms. The thing loves to live in the gallbladder after they get better, more so in females than in males, which is what caused typhoid Mary to be typhoid Mary. Now, there's three different states that we would consider carrier states. We have an asymptomatic carrier state. Right? The individual never shows symptoms of the disease, okay, but can still infect others and be the asymptomatic carrier. You have your incubatory carrier. which transmits the pathogens during the incubation period before the symptoms kind of kick in. And then you have your convalescent carrier, which gets sick, gets better, has no more symptoms, but now can spread it. So just different kinds of carriers, they're all still considered carriers of whatever disease they have. Definition, you probably need to know, right? Latent or latency period is the time from infection to communicable time period. Okay. You have the incubation period. Time interval between the infection when you actually get it or exposed to it and the initial onset of the clinical illness. And then your communicable period, which is the infectious agent may be transferred from an infected person or animal to suspected host. It's the time that you're actually sick, right? Or you can spread it. Right? And that's what this little map here, or this little diagram here is for, right? Here's your incubation period, here's your infection when you got exposed. You have a time period where it's going to harbor in your system before it finally kicks in, and you actually get the disease. You have a latent period where it can sit dormant in your body, or it may hit some sort of incubation period and then it'll kick in, cause the disease, or it'll get you to a period of communicability, in which case the period of communicability can also overlap your latent or your incubation period, and that period of communicability can also be the disease time period, right? Because in some cases, like rotavirus and norovirus, not only can you spread it before the illness really kicks in, but you're spreading it after the illness is over and your symptoms are gone. You're still shedding it for a couple of weeks after. So some of these things kind of overlap with each other. You guys remember these things? Measles incubation period, usually 14 days, on average 10 to 12. Right? Communicable time periods, 4 days before the rash onset. Here it says 4 days after. It's usually about a week after. You're still able to spread measles. And this is one of the higher communicable issues that we have. FA incubation usually 28 to 30 days. That's on average. Right? The communicable part is the first latter half of the incubation. So we'll say it's 30 days, so that's 4 weeks. We'll go back 2 weeks. So about 2 weeks in, during the incubation period, you're already starting to spread FA. Okay? So a few days after onset of jaundice. So after jaundice, and that's, here it says a few days, usually it's about a week or so after jaundice as well, that you can still spread. And then smallpox, incubation period 7 to 17 days. Typically it's 10 to 14 days on average. Here it's got from onset of symptoms, fever. When you hit that fever, you're also getting those blisters and that rash at the same time. So fever, rash at the same time here, all the way up to the separation of those scabs. Because remember, those scabs still may contain some of the smallpox virus in it. So that communicable time period is rather long, because you have to wait till all of them fall off. Okay, some more definitions for you guys. Quarantine, separation of well persons who have been exposed to contagious disease. Okay. Keyword here for quarantine is well person. Someone who's still healthy, right? So say, for example, you had COVID, I came next to you. Now, I may have been exposed to COVID. I will be put in quarantine even though I have no symptoms. I'm still healthy, I'm not sick. Versus isolation, where it's separation and restriction when there's an ill person who had a contagious disease, right? So if I showed up with tuberculosis, where I could spread it to everybody, right, they would take me and they would isolate me someplace until that communicable period of the disease was over, so I don't spread it to folks. The other deal, quarantine, you could probably do at home, which is what we did during COVID. We quarantined everybody. Right? Everybody wasn't sick, but everybody got quarantined. Versus isolation, where folks that actually had it, they tried to put in positive or negative pressure rooms, which we didn't have enough of, in the hospital setting. So usually those isolations are usually done in hospital settings. There are few times where we can do isolation at home. Those are based on the illness and your ability to be alone within your own home. Executive Order 1329.5. That is an executive order. You guys know what executive order means? That came from the president. Right? That says that if any of these things on this list, that means that we can invoke the Commerce Comitas. Okay? Commerce Comitas is Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, where it says, in any of these cases, we empower the Human Health Services person in charge, the Secretary of Human Health Services. They will empower the CDC to make, enforce regulations to prevent the spread of communicable diseases within the U.S. and from foreign countries. Okay, so when we did the quarantining of the U.S., when COVID kicked off, everyone was groaning and saying it wasn't legal. It was legal. This is part of our laws and policies that we have. Because we haven't done it in such a long time, people didn't realize that this was a thing. Okay? But it stems from this executive order. The president's not the one that's doing it. He's empowering the Secretary of Health to push it down to the CDC to enact some of the things that are going to help the populace, which is why this gets enacted. Public health is really dealing with population. Okay. Now, back in the 18th and 19th century, when we had yellow fever as a problem, back in, I believe it was 1773, when the U.S. was still coming about, we had a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia. One of the first times that they enacted something similar to this in this country back in 1793. Okay. Along with that came some maritime quarantines. That means if you're coming from overseas, they were keeping you on your ship for a couple of weeks before they would allow you to come on land. So okay, historically, we had done these things. It's just the fact that it's been such a long time since we've done some of these things. Typhoid Mary, she was forcibly detained because she was patient zero. They can detain you and put you or incarcerate you if they don't want to isolate you. Okay? But remember, they put her away the first time, they let her go, and she went out, she did it again, and they went ahead and threw her in jail for 30 years. Okay? Can they do that? Yes, yes they can. This is why. Okay? There was an Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014 and 2016. We sent, I think it was about 195 scientists and doctors over there, right? When they came back, although they voluntarily chose to be quarantined, some of this could have been enacted for them if they chose not to, and they quarantined those people until that communicable time period passed, so that we knew they weren't going to spread that stuff around in the United States before they came back. So this is a big deal. We do have precedents for this, especially when people don't understand that we do have policy for this. And back in 2020, 2022, when COVID kicked off, and we did this, everyone was in an uproar. But Comitas, Section 361, is the main reason why we can't. So here's a nice little breakdown of your quarantine versus isolation. For an individual who's healthy, we can quarantine if they're sick because they're ill. That will be isolation. Duration, incubation period for quarantine, communicable period for isolation. Location for quarantine, generally home. Isolation, more so the hospital than home, but we can use special circumstances to allow them to be home for isolation. And then basis of action, rarely use police power for quarantine. And isolation is common standard precautions if we need to use police power. Okay. Big deal. Epidemiology triangle, or triad in this case. It's got 3 points. It's got the causative agent, all right, what makes you sick. Got the susceptible person or host, whether it be you or being an animal, and then your environment. Okay. That's your geography, that's your weather, that's your altitude, it's a whole bunch of different things, right? And we use this to explain the cause and the spread of the disease. Okay. The agent can be anything from bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungal, chemical agents. Be a whole bunch of different things. Right? And the host has a whole bunch of different things that would make them susceptible. Right? As we've gone through ID, we talked about a whole bunch of different things. Right? We talked about age, making people susceptible. We talked about immune status, making people susceptible. We talked about genetics, making people susceptible. We talked about some people's behaviors making them susceptible. So understanding a lot of these things will kind of help us as we go on with being able to put things in place to protect us from those things. And for the environment piece, it's economics, geography, education, and access to healthcare. There's a whole bunch of different things. If we understand them, we can target some interventions that kind of interrupt that causative, susceptible environmental condition. So these are some of the things that we mentioned for that epidemiology triangle for your host, it's your age, your prior exposures, your co-infections. This is your susceptible individual in your population. It's going to be part of that point of that triangle. So for some of us, we end up becoming primary hosts, where the organism reaches maturity inside of us and makes us sick. We can become secondary hosts, where we intervene in a life cycle, like cysticercosis, where instead of eating the infected pig, we go ahead and just eat the infection itself, and then it goes ahead and moves to our muscles, and then it ends there. But we're still that secondary or intermediate host. And in some other cases, like West Nile virus, we end up becoming a dead-end host, right? Which means that mosquito bites us, it infects us, we get a little bit sick, mild flu-like symptoms, but it doesn't develop enough in our system to make us be able to continue to spread it. So West Nile is usually a mosquito bird issue, okay? But when it affects us, it just ends up dying with us because we don't have enough in our system to continue to spread it. So that's part of your host stuff. Okay. Here's some agents, right? Bacteria, parasites, microbes. With these guys, we have to be careful because of the reservoirs. reservoirs are those other things that carry these things that come and infect us. Right? We talk dogs with rabies, rodents with hunta, mosquitoes with malaria. All those things are reservoirs that are coming and infecting us. So we have to be careful with that. Environment, climate, altitude, pollution. Okay. Big things that we look for here is understanding that altitude, usually around 6,500 feet above sea level, you don't usually have mosquitoes. Right? So mosquito-borne illnesses at that point usually decrease drastically, right? Then when we talk about humidity, we can talk about the two different types of viruses. We have the non-enveloped virus. Right? If you guys remember that, the non-enveloped viruses are the ones that just have protein on the outside. They don't have a fatty lipid. They don't have that fatty lipid. They're a little bit more resilient than in harsh environments. Mice, the ones that have a fatty lipid on the outside of them, they're less resilient than human type environments. Okay, how do we get stuff? Direct, we can do direct contact. Right? That'd be your varicella and your smallpox. Droplet spread, right? For people coughing or sneezing, and you get it that way. You can do indirect stuff by airborne, which means if I cough, the stuff lingers in the air for a couple of hours, right? So for example, TB can linger in the air for about 4 to 6 hours, right? So if you walk in after I cough with TB stuff, that's your indirect airborne infection or mode of transmission. Then you have vehicle-borne, including fomites. Okay, remember fomites are toys, can be clothes, right? You can still spread it that way, especially when we talk about mice. Then you got your vector-borne, mechanical, or biological. The mechanical is where an insect generally carries a pathogen from something infected to you as the host. And then you smash it, you scratch it off your skin, then you infect yourself. Versus biological, such as a mosquito comes and bites you, spreads it, and that is a biological transfer. Here's a couple of examples of direct contact, touching, kissing, sexual contact. And there's some disease examples. Probably need to know this slide. Okay, droplet spread, large droplets from source less than 1 meter. The larger droplets, usually 5 microns, is what we look at. Those usually fall somewhat quickly. The droplets that are usually less than 5 microns, not only do they hang out in the air for longer periods of time, but they also can get re-aerosolized. So if they fall on something and you shake that something out, it may go back up into the air to become aerosolized again. So we have to be careful with the really smaller droplets versus these larger droplets. Okay, so here's some indirect airborne transmissions. So here it's telling you less than 5 microns. Those are the ones that can get re-aerosolized, or those are the ones that can stay up in the air for longer periods of time. We can use blasto as an example, right? Because it gets kicked up by the sand and dust in the southwest and gets aerosolized. You have vehicle-borne, right? We talked about a bunch of these during ID. You have foodborne, waterborne, and fomites. Means of control for those things. And then at the bottom end, you've got your vector-borne to spread throughout arthropods. There you've got your mechanical, okay, which carries that pathogen to you. The animal itself, whatever the arthropod may be, whether it be the roach, whether it be the mosquito itself, isn't generally affected by whatever pathogen they're bringing to you for mechanical transmission. Okay? And the same deal generally goes with the biological. Okay, that mosquito that's coming to bite you generally isn't sick with that problem. They're only spreading the problem and then spreading it to you. Okay, so frequency measures, how can we quantify this? And that's the hard part. This is where we get into a bunch of definitions, and this is where we get into a bunch of stats for this thing. Okay. We're going to use prevalence, we're going to use incidence, we're going to use attack rates. Prevalence is more so for disease burden right now. Incidence is risk of developing that disease, and the attack rates are more for outbreaks or epidemics, so that we can determine specific populations that are affected during those time periods. And is one count of a number of cases sufficient? No. A raw number that says one count is not sufficient for public health stuff. We can put that into context, right? So let's say, for example, I tell you we had 1,000 measles cases, right? And the town had 10,000 people. Is that a big deal? Yes, because if you do the math, right, that's 10% of your population, right? 10% of your population. Right, it's me telling you, okay, you have 1,000 measles cases, but you're in a population of 3 million. Right? Does that make a difference?
Yeah.
It does, because at that point, your numbers drop to like 0.0003% of the population. So numbers have to be put in context, and it can't just be one single number. It's got to be in context with a whole bunch of other things. That's technically what that statement's really trying to tell you. So here are some more definitions for you. Endemic. That's what we talked about, where it's most common depending upon the geographical location. Right? This is generally where we'll find those disease processes or issues. Sporadic. This means it's going to occur frequently and regularly. Sometimes it'll pop up, sometimes it won't. A lot of times that usually happens in endemic areas. Then you have an epidemic where it occurs. Here it says communities or in regions, which is probably a little bit better for terminology's sake. Epidemic for regions of excess of normal expectancy. Okay, they have outbreak and cluster there. What we need to know with epidemic is that it occurs in two forms. It occurs as an outbreak and it occurs as a cluster. Generally, it will occur within an endemic area, but in some cases, like we'll say Lyons, Connecticut, we had a cluster of people with a whole bunch of the same symptoms. So they labeled that cluster as a slight epidemic for Lyme disease when it first happened. Versus an outbreak, which is more limited to geography, in which case the region aspect of it, the epidemic, makes a little bit more sense. And then you have the pandemic, which is what we've had with COVID, influenza, and Spanish flu, and all that other stuff. Okay, or affects the entire world. And in some cases, it'll start affecting several countries first, and then it'll just start spreading. Okay. All right. Real quick, the ratio. Comparison of two numbers. They can be unrelated. Just shows the relationship between two numbers. So in this case, if we were to do the math here for a ratio of 1.25 clinics per 10,000 people, you would divide 1.25 by 1.25, which gives you 1. You would divide 10,000 by 1.25, which gives you about 8,000. So it would be 1 clinic per 8,000 people. Just the ratio. Okay. comparison of two numbers, that's all that is. Then we get the proportion. And proportion is a comparison where the number, or the numerator, is part of the denominator, right? So here, for your example, you've got in class 40 students, 10 students are left-handed, right? Those 10 students are part of that total 40. Okay? And there, you just divide 10 by 40, give you your proportion. At 0.25, multiply that times 100, give you 25%. Simple stuff, right? Nothing extremely hard. What does get a little bit more tenuous will be with your rate, which is a measure of frequency with which an event occurs in a defined population over a specific time period. Okay? And it gets a little dicey when we talk about a specific time period. Really, all the rate's showing you is how fast something is happening, okay, in a population during a specific time period. Okay. So here's the things that you kind of need for the formula. Okay, you need the number of cases in every illness or condition, you need the size of the population at risk, and the period for which we're calculating the risk. Okay. So that means that when you take a look at the number of cases, we need to make sure that we have those number of cases within the same time period that we use for the population at risk. So if we do 3,000 for number of new cases, okay, we have to have the appropriate population that was around for that time, for that same time period. So if we have 3,000 during 1 year, your population total should be the population exposed for that 1 year time period. So we could say 3 million. Okay? And then we just divide the number of cases by the population at risk. Now, the thing that's not on here that we really need to talk about is right here we have a multiplier of 100. See that? Okay. Here we have a multiplier of 100. Okay. That multiplier really is based on, number one, the number of zeros that you're going to get after you divide those two, and whether it's standard disease, whether it's birth rate, whether it's a rare, extremely rare case. So if we're talking birth rates and death rates, usually our multiplier will be 1,000. Okay. If we talk about diseases, if we talk about injury rates, some rare diseases, then usually we'll use anywhere between 10,000 to 100,000 as your multiplier. Whichever one gets you closest to either a whole number or the least amount of zeros that you can get. And then when we talk about rare, extremely rare cases and certain cancers, we'll use 1,000,000 as your denominator. I mean, as your multiplier. So it's really based on what you're really trying to calculate out. Right? So we'll use 2023, we had 1,200 measles cases that year in the United States, 2023. So that would be our new number of cases. The U.S. population time period was about 330 million. All right, 330 million. So pretty simple. You would divide your 1,200 by your 330 million. Because this is a disease, we're going to use 100,000 as the multiplier, in which case, once you do the math, it ends up coming out to 0.36. So 0.36 cases per 100,000 people for the year of 2023. That would be that answer. Questions? We're frequency measures used to describe the presence of disease in a population or the probability of risk. Morbidity means the condition of being diseased, right, because you're sick. Okay. And we have some tools that we use to figure these things out. Some of those tools are attack rates, incidence, and prevalence. And we use that to describe some of the mobility within our population. Okay. How do those things help? They'll kind of, they tell us how many people are sick. Right? It tells us the risk of becoming sick. And it also tells us how often the disease is going to be occurring within an X population or geographic region. So some of those that we're about to look at right now are extremely important. So those are all a whole bunch of definitions, okay, which probably be on your desk. It's much harder to do a bunch of scenarios for you, right? So attack rate is a proportion of people who become ill after being exposed. Okay. Your secondary attack rate is the proportion of susceptible individuals who become infected after exposure to the primary cause. So remember, secondary is always after the fact. Okay. Secondary is always after the fact. Incidence is the new cases of the disease that develop in the population during a specific time period. Remember, incidence has to have a specific time period. Okay. Incidence has to have a specific time period, and it's new cases. Okay. New cases within a specific time period. Okay. In a population. Then you have point prevalence. Okay. Portion of population that has a disease at a single point in time. Point prevalence is disease at a single point in time. So if you think of point prevalence, think of a snapshot in time. That is what point prevalence is, a snapshot in time. Then you have period prevalence, which is a little bit longer than that. It's a proportion of the population that has a disease at any time during a specific time period. And usually we measure out those time periods to see if it's trending up or down. Right? Incidence versus prevalence. Okay. The definition of incidence refers to the number of new cases, right? We just mentioned that, new cases of a disease or health condition that develop in a specific population during a defined period of time. Okay. So there's three things in there. New cases, specific population, defined period of time. And what's going to tell us? It's going to tell us the risk or probability of developing the disease. That's what this is going to tell us. And here at the bottom, it gives you your numerator and it gives you your denominator. And the numerator being the new cases, and then the denominator is your total population at risk during that time period. Okay. Incidence, measure of events, this measure of risk. Here it just covers a little bit more like the denominator only includes those who may become part of the denominator or part of the numerator. So that means the population at the bottom, the denominator, has to include the folks that could possibly be sick. That's all that's telling you. Okay. And then understand incidence is a rate of time because it's over a specific time period, so that denominator should be an element of time. Okay, here's an example for your incidence. Okay, you watch a group of 5,000 people in your town, right? So that's your total population. Okay, during a 5-year time period, that's your specific time period. Right? 25 individuals are newly diagnosed with diabetes mellitus. That is your new cases that just developed within those 5,000 people over that 5-year time period. Okay? So you divide your new people by the total people that you had, right? 5,000 times 5 years. That is your specific time period that you're looking at. So 5,000 times 5 drops it down to 25,000 people per year. And then you divide your 25 by your 25,000 people per year. gives me 0.001. Take that out to 1,000, which you have one case per 1,000 people per year. If you have questions about that, you can see me after, and we can cover some of that if you like. I don't know. I haven't read it. You want some math on it? Okay. I could ask you that. I haven't read it, but sure. Not a problem. I don't want it to be rough like farm. And if we do, I'll probably add the formula in there. All right. The deal with this is some of you may be doing this. Some of you may do public health. I've got a couple of PA friends here in the Army that do public health. That is their job. I've got one guy who is in charge of public health before Ryder. Okay. As a PA. So this is something that we may do. This is something that we may do and we can fall into as a job. But the difference being, if you need to calculate some of these numbers, you guys will be able to have these formulas when you need to calculate them. So if I do add some problems on there, I'll probably put the formula on there. Okay, you guys just need to know how to use the formula. Okay. But again, I haven't written the test yet, so we'll see. Specific rates refers to a rate calculated for a specific subgroup. Population based on characteristics such as age, sex, race, or cost. Right? Makes sense, right? Specific rates for specific characteristics. Pretty clear there. And then the adjusted rates are a little bit different. The rate has been statistically modified to remove the effects of one or more compounding variables, right? So if you look at specific rates, I'm going to just measure the rates of specific ages. I'm just going to measure the rate of specific genders. Okay? That tells me how bad it is within, we'll say, men, okay? Or how bad it is within children, okay? Versus the adjusted rates where we just take them all and put them together. Okay? We take all the old folks, we take all the young folks, everybody in between, and we just crunch all the numbers. Okay? That completely takes out all the confounding variables that we use when we do specifics. Okay? Now, the nice thing about adjusted rates is it tells you actuality. It tells you reality. Okay? Let's say we have, what are two studs? The two studs over there, right? We can't just use those two guys as how the rest of us are going to fare if we get sick. Right? It makes a lot more sense if we use all of us together as a rate, adjusted rate, to determine how things are going to look. And this is where you have to use some of this stuff when you're reviewing your research, when you're looking at research or reading journals, especially for pharmacology stuff. Because pharmacology is very notorious for doing specific rates versus adjusted rates. Okay? And what I mean by that is they will hone out specific populations, generally that are healthy with this specific problem, and then they will give it to them and they'll say, hey, look, out of all these people, they did well. But once you do adjusted rates, right, which means, hey, I just released this medication to the populace, to everyone. Then you start noticing the reality of the side effects, right? And that's the benefit of specific versus the adjusted rates. Prevalence is the total number of existing cases, both new and old, of a disease in a population at a given time period over a specific time period. Right? That's where you do point prevalence versus period prevalence. Right? Point prevalence being that specific snapshot period prevalence being that over time. This tells us the burden of disease in the community. So we discuss at a specific time period and over time. So here's your point prevalence specific. So point prevalence of disease at a single point in time, right? Because it is a single point in time, it is that snapshot that you get. And what you can do is you can do a whole bunch of snapshots, and then you can develop a trend. Or you can do period prevalence, all cases within a certain time period, we'll say that a year, right? And then we can just notice that trend there too. So you have different options. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. All about risk, prevalence is about the burden that it's causing. Okay. Simple stuff, right? This one is in reference to steady state. And steady state refers to is a situation where the number of new cases or incidents, right, new cases of a disease is balanced by the number of people leaving the pool, right, leaving the population. And by leaving, I mean they're either recovering, they're dying, or they're migrating or some other reason. Okay. Now, the big thing here, this, is we say when this goes up, this section over here goes up. Right? So this incidence has to go up if this prevalence goes up. If this prevalence goes down, then this incidence goes down. Okay? That'll create your steady state. And this is just real simple stuff. Prevalence is all cases, right, over that specific time period, and incidence is new cases, or all existing, or new cases during that time period. Prevention and control. These things you should be somewhat aware of, right? What factors influence which control measures you use. That's based on what you're doing, right? What you're doing, where you're going. Okay? Because what you need to do is you need to find the right control measure depending upon what you're doing and where you're going. Some of this stuff may vary. You may have social constraints, you may have economic constraints, you may have logistical constraints. So when we talk about deployment, for some of us, we need to make sure that we know where we're going. We can figure out what the risk is going to be to our population, and we need to pregame and get everything we need prior to going, because by the time we get there, depending upon when we're going, we may or may not have a logistical train to get us what we need. So initially, you need to make sure you pregame all of this stuff. Okay. Here's a nice little timetable of when things have occurred. Right? BSI is that bovine spongiform, that's the prion disease stuff that we talked about. Indra is a foot bat disease that affects horses. I mean, horse fluids, when we're around them, can affect us. That one has like about a 60% death rate for humans if we're infected. Okay. So this one just shows a whole bunch of the zoonotic outbreaks that we've had over time since the 90s. Right? So prevention and control is key for public health. This stuff tells us prevention and control is cornerstone for public health. Okay? So protecting the population from disease, so we can reduce some of the disparities and overall well-being of folks is what they need to do, or what they generally do. Okay? This one is big. Okay? This is a big issue. Okay? Interactions between intensification of livestock production, zoonosis, and antimicrobial resistance, right? This is what everybody wants. This is what everybody gets. This is what he's trying to intensify. Because these guys are trying to get this. Okay? Through any means necessary. Right? So this intensification of this livestock production increases the risk of zoonotic disease and accelerates antimicrobial resistance, creating a complex and dangerous cycle that threatens both the animals and us. Okay? Because remember, they're trying to crank out as many animals as they possibly can. Right? We want more food. They want to make more money. Right? So what do they do to make some of their livestock better? Keep them healthier, better, bigger. Right? They use antibiotics, they use steroids, they use hormones. Some of those cases, those antibiotics are causing antibiotic resistance. Right? And that stuff is coming on over to us. And we're perpetuating that because we're what we get. There's some seriously bad bacteria out there that we do not have any antibiotics for. I forgot what they're called. They've got like a crazy name. Deadly virus, deadly bacteria. It's got some crazy name to it that we don't have any antibiotics for. Okay? They're thinking some of this has some of the reasoning behind why we're getting some of these super infections out there. Okay? Now, because they're trying to build and make more, all these livestock are being crammed into places together. As they're crammed into places together, they've got contact issues, they've got respiratory issues. They can spread stuff to each other. Okay? If they don't have a fast turnover, then they have to lose a month. That's not what they want. A lot of that confined space really stresses out a lot of those animals, making their immune system drop, making them sick. Okay? Which is what we don't want. Okay? But their overuse in the intensification of that livestock production is not good. It gets into our food supply and then it just affects us. It's not good. Okay. So this brings us back to our little triangle here, the epidemiologic triangle. Here, within the triangle now, we still have the agent, the host, and the environment, right? But if you look at each little corner there, it talks about means that we can do, right? Public health can do, to try to protect the overall population. Okay? We can protect the individual, we can educate the individual, we can alter exposures, we can change activity, we can quarantine, we can isolate, we can do a whole bunch of different things. So understanding where we can affect it is part of the key to this, right? If we understand where we can affect things, we can make change, right? And that's what this is all about. This is what we call the hierarchy of control. We're going to see this again later. So if we take a look at it now, this is basically borrowed from occupational health and safety. It's kind of a framework for controlling hazardous issues. And it's real simple, right? If you look at the bottom, upside down pyramid, if you look at the bottom, PPE, right, protective equipment, is the least effective things that we can do. Right, and least effective. Versus the most effective, which would be elimination of the problem. So, elimination of the problem, right? Any kind of physical issues that we have, any physical hazards that we have, based on the job that you're doing. Right? If we can eliminate that, that is the best thing that we could possibly do. And then it goes down from there. There's something that you're doing and we can substitute it because it's hazardous. Substitute it with something that's not so hazardous, a little bit safer. and let's do that. And these are all really dependent on what your job is. It's really dependent on what your job is, because we're talking overall population, not just medical. Okay, anybody have a question? Okay. Some of the things I want to talk about here, you guys have already seen. Right? So you guys can chime in when you want. Here's our terminal learning objective. Here's some of the behavioral learning objectives that we're going to cover that are defined, some of that disease burden. So, disease burden for the U.S. military is much more difficult to interpret and understand than it is for the civilian sector. How do we quantify operational effectiveness and mission? Those two statements alone make it a lot more difficult to quantify what burden would be from someone getting sick in the military. Right? We've got a lot of things to look at when we do that, right? What position do they hold within their unit? Right? If it's a sole position, it's only one guy that does this whole thing, even if he's an E4. Extremely critical, right? Compared to having a fat 05 that sits around and does nothing. Right? Do you need that guy? Oh, you probably don't need that guy. Right? So he's not critical to you. How do you put those into context so that you can determine that burden? The monetary aspect, which is what they use in the civilian sector, is pretty easy. We all make a salary, take our salary minus the time that you miss work, there's your monetary burden. It's not a problem. Healthcare costs, how do we justify that? In the military, what you guys are going to do, you guys are going to justify it by doing RVUs. Okay? That's how we justify our work when we start seeing patients. It's not a problem. RVUs, or what we use as play money in the military to justify how much money we're going to ask Congress. How do we use that as a burden? So it's a little bit more difficult to justify burden in the military. Right? Here it's got duty time lost. Right? 24 hours quarters, 48 hours quarters, 72 hours quarters. Right? Max you should give anybody 72 hours quarters. Right? What about status post-surgery? Right? Intramural sports. Usually gets most people hurt in the military for some strange reason. Right? What happens if they get hurt there? How long are they ineffective to be able to do their job, especially if you have to deploy? These are all things that make it a lot more difficult for us to determine that burden. But nevertheless, there is still a burden because we're missing a body. That's the importance of some of these conditions. Okay, here's some key factors for determining some of that burden, total loss sorting days. And I will get onto a small soapbox with this. Okay? I need you guys to understand what some of the processes are for your individual services. Okay? Most services, at the 6-month time period of you taking care of a patient, you, as a PA, need to send them to a specialist if you have it. That is what the regulation says. The regulation also says at 365 days, you can submit for medical evaluation board. Some guidance to see whether or not they do or do not continue to stay in the military based on the problem that they have. But if you have not sent them to a specialist by that time period, you just walked up, because now you have to hold someone longer periods of time. Okay? I was sent to be the division PA for Bliss because the medical records was employed and they were about to deploy in 2 years. When I arrived there, these little short duration time periods that you see here, there were people on profile after profile after profile after profile for the same reason, with multiple profiles for the same reason, and nobody was doing anything about it. We had people on profile for greater than 365 days. We had, the longest one that we found was for 4 years. We had a patient on profile for 4 years and it wasn't permanent. Okay? You did that. Okay? When I say you, we, PAs, right? PAs were running these patients. Okay? Which is why I tell you, understand the process. Understand what's supposed to happen. Okay? When I arrived there was a lot of people that did not understand the concept and the process. Right? Within your battalion, for the Army guys, every 30 days you're supposed to do a profile review with your commander to let them know who is and isn't available for deployment. And that goes on, right? It goes from battalion, it goes to brigade, and it goes to division. None of that was happening when I was there. Right? So you need to understand the part about short durations and long durations. Even if it's one individual person, that individual person is taking up a slot in the unit that you know is about to deploy. Okay? That's part of that burden that becomes a problem for those units that are getting ready to deploy. Okay? So some of those things that you really need to look at is the severity, the risk of exposure, the ease of transmission, any of those things, many of those things. Okay? So, on the canvas page that I showed you, this is on there. Okay? This is for all services, and if you read the bottom there, prepared in collaboration with the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, they're a lot stricter than our flight surgeon guys are. Army Public Health Center, Navy and Marine Corps Public Health Center. Okay? This is for all services. These are for reportable medical events that represent inherent or significant threat to public health and medical operations. Okay? This somewhat mirrors the one from the CDC for 2025, except for this one runs through the military. And inside of this thing, you have specific POCs for every service if you're going to report something. So this is actually a pretty good book if you guys want to read through. I think it's like 114 pages, not that bad. Right? It gives you the breakdown of all the disease processes, and then after that, it gives you a small synopsis of each of the disease processes that it talks about. And the principal goal of this document is to achieve, right, consistency, data consistency. You need to know this is what we got going on so we can build that picture. Right? And we want to standardize all this stuff so that when it gets reported, we can see if we've got trends going on that we can affect. Right? And this goes across all services to aid in their understanding of what is it looking like at the local level. What is it looking like where you are going to practice or are practicing? Okay. Here's all of the ones that they have. There's 70 of them. If you go through some of these, we covered a whole bunch of them. Right? There's your measles, your malaria, your coccal mumps, norovirus, and viruses. So a whole bunch of the stuff that's in here we covered. These are your reportable stuff. like I said, as you go through the book, there's little synopsis of each one of these things in there. So it might actually be a good little study guide too. Things that you need to prioritize for risk of exposures when you're employed for exposure categories. Right? What we want to do is we want to try to preserve, maintain, and restore, right, the health of the military population as a whole. Okay? We want to try to anticipate, predict, identify, right, surveillance, evaluation, prevention, control of disease, specifically the notable ones that are reportable, by doing all these things, by looking at the local food and water, by looking at your field hygiene. And field hygiene is usually what gets most people sick. It's as simple as washing your hands. Now, the Army has a couple of ARs 40-5 and PAPAM 40-11, I believe. And then the Navy has a bunch of volumes, NAVMED P50-10 or 5010, and then the Air Force has a bunch of AFIs that, a bunch of different AFIs. They have one AFI that's 48-105, and these are main public health, surveillance, and disease conditions, and then again a whole bunch of other ones, very similar to what the Army has. But we all have a whole bunch of regulations under our individual services. Okay, so food and waterborne diseases. Nothing we don't already know, right? Proper food procurement procedures. Not taking care of your water, definitely bad. Drinking water off the local economy that's not bottled, pretty bad. Right? We want to stick to something that we know is good. Eating on the local economy. Now, my take on this as a lieutenant captain when I got deployed, they're like, hey sir, can we eat here? I'm like, I got a bunch of sick rows, sure, why not? Right? Probably not the right answer, right? But what we did was we sent two folks who watched them cook, and then they brought the food out to us. So we did eat some local stuff. Okay? And I did have to use some shipment for some folks. But again, understand that is a decision that you will be making as a provider. Should your guys be eating local stuff? Some higher headquarters will tell you no. That will be part of your rules of engagement down there, whether you can or can't. If they don't say that you can, your choice as a provider, right? You're going to be the one taking care of the farm public. Okay? I would just caution you to be careful, because if you look at the picture there, he's got meat hanging out there. You got mosquitoes all over those things, laying eggs in there. Okay, no refrigeration. And hygiene's probably not there as well. So, gotta be careful. Just be careful. Right? Most dining facilities, talking overseas, maybe have a little hand washing station before you go in. Okay? Be careful with person-to-person spread, especially in field conditions. Right? Big thing when you walk into those little tents, you see everybody sleeping head to head instead of foot to head. Now they're breathing all over each other. So, field sand is a big deal. We don't have field sand teams that go out everywhere. You are that field sand team, or you will be that field sand team in some cases. I didn't learn how to chlorinate water till I had to chlorinate water. So keep that in mind. That's what those DA pans are good for. That's how I learned to chlorinate water. I didn't learn it at PS. So this goes back to our little hierarchy, right? How to protect our forces. Like we said, this is just a framework. We want to try to minimize some of those hazards as best we can. And elimination is the most effective method, which involves completely removing whatever hazard is the problem. That is the most effective way to control exposure to the source. Okay? The least effective way is just doing PPE. Just PPE would be a gown, gloves, glasses, a mask. Okay? In many cases, that's just not enough for us. We can do a little bit more. Okay? When we talk about administrative controls, it's more along the lines of administrative policies. What do I need to do? How do I need to do it? How do I adjust this practice, my SOP, to make this a little bit safer? Okay? That's generally what administrative controls usually brings to the table, right? That includes, right, making sure that everyone washes their hands before they go and eat. That's part of hand hygiene. Right? Making that standard. Stuff, right? Then you have your engineering controls where you may need some sort of physical solution. And there we're talking more air filtration systems. Right? In hospitals, we're talking isolation, should be in a pressure room. And push all that air out, and you want to get filtrated so that it doesn't infect other folks. Putting up barriers, improving sanitation structures for people to be able to wash their hands appropriately. Engineering controls. Your substitutions is basically trying to replace hazardous stuff with more safer alternatives. That's all your substitution is. But just understand that elimination is your most effective method, and PPE is your least effective method. Absolute control over food and water. Super important. You need to know where it comes from. You need to know what's in it, preferably. Here it says washing hand hygiene is extremely important. That's usually what makes most folks sick when they go down range. But then here it also says ensure bulk water supply is appropriately managed. And it says field sanitation. There are no field sanitation teams. No, that's you. It's going to be understand that there is a PAM for field sanitation, there is a PAM for chlorination of water. Okay. You may need those when you go down. Eating on the economy here can be prohibited when necessary. That is dependent on your higher headquarters, whether they will or will not allow you to eat on the economy. And that depends on where you are and what you do. And then, education to lower the risk. A lot of times when we travel abroad, they tell us to go to higher end places because they know the higher end places have a better hygiene, even though it's going to cost more money. And that's more so for your safety overall. And then routine vaccinations. If we can vaccinate folks with stuff, let's make sure that they're completely vaccinated before they go wherever they're going to go. Because that will be better. That will be much better of prevention than we're doing. Vector-borne diseases, mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks, mites, fleas. Right? Have we talked about these things already? These guys are probably some of the most deadliest things that we have on this planet. These guys kill more people than sharks. These guys kill people by the millions across the world. So their brothers, right? Malaria, dengue, Zika, West Nile, yellow fever, a lot of bad stuff. I kind of like this one because it shows the impact when we talk about preventive medicine. It's 225 Marines on shore in Liberia for 10 days, right? Out of the 225, 145 of them remained healthy. 80 of them returned back with a febrile illness. Right off the bat, removing 80 of them, put them at 36% down. Okay? Would you consider your unit still mission effective when you're 36% down? You would also probably be better. That you're 8 bodies short. That's not good, right? The magic number for deployment is minimum 92%. Okay? So these guys are already 36% done. Way less than 92%. Out of those 80, 36 of them were able to be taken care of on the ship. Okay? The other 44 had to get evacuated. So out of those 80, 20%, even worse because they had to get shipped out. So this is a prime example of making sure that your people are prepared and taken care of for whatever environment they're going into. Right? These guys could have been given doxy, right? They start 2 days before they go out, and they probably would have been protected. But nothing was done. And they came back sick. At least 36%. You guys want to go over malaria? Or you guys want to wait till tomorrow? Wait till tomorrow. Go on or no?
No. We lost part of the class to UA anyways.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and stop there. And we'll pick it up tomorrow. But just remember that the rest of this is going to be